5:42 Fort Benning. The whop of a UH-1 Huey rotor cuts across the training ground. A map of Vietnam lies spread on the sand table. A pencil stops at the Ia Drang area. If the terrain makes ground mobility impractical, we shift the axis of mobility to the air. 1964. The battlefield in Vietnam, endless jungle and folding ridgelines. Swamps act like natural traps, swallowing both vehicles and men. Every road is difficult. No tracked vehicle can manage it. Terrain becomes an invisible enemy, breaking apart every doctrine of ground mobility. In the West, many conservative officers still insist helicopters are only for hauling supplies and medevac. To them, the sky is not a battlefield. But at Fort Benning, a group of officers looked at the Vietnamese jungle and asked, if the ground is denied, why not open the fight in the air? That idea was called air mobility by air. They wanted to turn helicopters from logistical craft into an aerial maneuver force that could overcome every terrain limitation. A division would not march through mud, it would fly over it. Doubt arose everywhere, but the group at Fort Benning did not stop. They believed wars could be decided by speed and the direction of approach. On the edge of the sand table, an unsigned memorandum reads, "Every minute saved in movement buys a new risk, hot loads, low-level flight, unsecured landing zones." The question is not, can it be done, but who bears the cost of the risk allocation? Air mobility was a declaration. If the enemy hides deep in the jungle, we will come straight down from the sky. An air cavalry formation could insert hundreds of soldiers into the enemy rear strike and withdraw before the opponent could react. It was a new rhythm of war, fast, precise, surprising. By 1965, the idea became real. The 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile was formed with a formidable helicopter force ready to take the tempo of combat into the sky. From muddy fields to the Ia Drang Valley, they proved that a division that could fly could change the conduct of war. Out of skepticism, a doctrine was born. It seized the sky and opened a new approach, its ultimate effectiveness to be decided by the terrain. P2. In 1963, in the sweltering heat at Fort Benning, the U.S. Army stood up the 11th Air Assault Division TEST under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's reform direction. Mission to validate the combat capability of infantry from the air and to turn helicopters once dismissed as logistics toys into the backbone of operations. Over 2 years, the unit flew 120,000 training sorties. Results were measured against test standards, company-level insertions in minutes, hauling a 105mm howitzer to a hilltop in under 15 minutes. Movement within a 30-kilometer radius faster than any equivalent ground mechanized unit. Pilots practiced landing on tiny LZs. Infantry practiced jumping from hovering helicopters, rifles at the ready. A maintenance team pried off a Huey's air filter cover. A fine red powder like brick dust poured out. Test notes read, "Turbine wear increases sharply when flying low in dusty air. Early failure rates exceed predictions." Mobility effectiveness is real, but mechanical costs grow exponentially. Beside the flight chart sat a graph. Every kilogram shaved from the load. A few extra seconds of safety margin while hovering. But each additional hover second also meant more exposure time to 12.7mm fire. Technical reports spelled out the price-high fuel consumption, heavy maintenance, vulnerability to air defenses, and bad weather. No army had ever bet an entire division on machines like these. Still, the data favored the concept. In every trial, helicopters demonstrated the ability to insert troops, deliver firepower resupply, and perform medevac, creating a closed operational cycle in the air. On June 29, 1965, the Pentagon made a historic decision. The 11th Air Assault Division TEST was reorganized into the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile, the world's first division, designed from the ground up for the air mobility doctrine. Authorized strength, 435 helicopters, Hueys, Chinooks, Scouts, later supplemented by the AH-1 Cobra, the first dedicated gunship. In August 1965, the division departed Fort Benning for Vietnam. Tempo reached 1,000 sorties per day. Reconnaissance insertion, close support, resupply, medevac. Operational cycle reconnaissance, transport insertion, gunship suppression of firing points, resupplies, medevac. From the training grounds of Fort Benning to the jungles of Ia Drang, the division that could fly had taken off. Ia Drang Valley, Vietnam, November 1965. The jungle smoked. The gunfire never stopped. Gunpowder, smoke mixed with the scent of red earth. This was air mobility's harshest test, no longer the Fort Benning training ground, but the line between life and death. The fight at LZ X-Ray forced the 1st Cavalry to prove its worth against the overwhelming firepower of the People's Army of Vietnam. On November 14, 1st Battalion 7th, cavalry commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, landed by UH-1 Huey on an open patch of ground. The mission seemed simple recon and engaged the enemy, but as the first waves finished landing, they realized it was an ambush. Hueys touched down for a few seconds and then lifted off, making room for the next group. The tempo was taut as a string. Radios barked Alpha down, Bravo standby, gunships suppress. A few hours later, more than 400 soldiers were in position. Weapons, ammunition, and hope all hung on the sky. The enemy did not remain idle. Roughly 2,000 troops concealed in the jungle struck from multiple directions as the last Huey left the LZ. 1-7 was surrounded. No trenches, no retreat, just open ground and enemy fire. In the air, helicopters were the only lifeline linking the battlefield to the rear. UH-1, Hueys, and CH-47. Chinooks circled relentlessly, hauling ammunition, water, and medicine into LZ X-Ray under anti-aircraft fire. Pilots flew just above the treetops, dodging machine guns and thrown grenades. One round into an engine was enough to bring a bird down. Above AH-1, Cobras poured rockets and machine gun fire to clear the way for the infantry. Rotors and explosions blended into a dense curtain of fire. Radio interference was intense. 3 days of fighting exacted a heavy toll. 84 helicopters damaged, 11 shot down. Some pilots did not return. A CH-47 took an engine hit, crashed and exploded on the landing zone. Yet the cycle did not break. One aircraft went down, another took its place. OH-6 scouts still prowled the skies for targets. Cobras followed with suppression runs. Damaged Hueys still flew medevac and dropped supplies. In desperation, air mobility shone. When ground routes were cut, Hueys landed at night under heavy fire, bringing in 10 tons of ammunition and evacuating 75 wounded. Without the helicopters, LZ X-Ray would almost certainly have been wiped out. One pilot logged. Each time we touched down meant getting more people out of the danger zone. Under Hal Moore's command, 1-7 held. The enemy was forced to withdraw after 3 days. U.S. losses were 234 killed, hundreds wounded. Enemy casualties numbered over 1,000. The operational plan for the area was broken. Ia Drang also exposed weaknesses. Helicopters were vulnerable to 12.7mm fire and later to shoulder-fired rockets. Weather, rain, and fog could paralyze the tempo. Operational costs were immense, as Fort Benning had warned. Still, Ia Drang confirmed air mobility on the battlefield. The air cavalry system operated like a machine: reconnaissance, insertion, support, resupply, evacuation faster and more practiced than any contemporary ground mobility doctrine. This battle put the 1st Cavalry Division airmobile in the history books, establishing air as a primary axis of mobility. But Ia Drang had a darker side. 2 days after X-Ray at LZ Albany, companies that had just landed walked into an ambush while moving single file through the forest. Helicopters had delivered them quickly, but it was hard to reassemble formations once columns stretched out in dense terrain. The Doctrine proved to arrive fast. Regrouping in the jungle was a different problem. Radio interference terrain, slicing formations, enemy fire locking down small pockets. The victory at X-Ray was therefore also a warning: air mobility was not immune to traps on the ground. Vietnam battlefield, 1965. The skies over Southeast Asia were not friendly to machine or man. Temperatures often hit 40 degrees Celsius, humidity at 90%. Thick, heavy air made every flight feel weighed down. Jungle swamps and red basalt dust-coated equipment. In this environment, air mobility faced both enemy fire and nature itself. Each takeoff was a technical trial, pushing the edge of physical limits. The UH-1, Huey, the soul of the air cavalry, was built for speed and maneuverability. But Vietnam was a corrosive environment. Fine red dust from the highlands the turbine's enemy wore downed turbine blades in just 25 flight hours, reducing efficiency. Technical reports noted dust particles pitted and eroded turbine blades with every rotation. As a result, Hueys needed near-daily inspections. Ground crews worked for hours in extreme heat. Heat and humidity turned the air into an aerodynamic disadvantage. At 40 degrees C, air density dropped, reducing rotor lift. A Huey normally carried 8-10 troops, but often had to cut down to 5 to 6 to ensure takeoff. Engines had to be throttled back to avoid turbine overheating. Humidity at 90% seeped into wiring and cables, causing random faults. One pilot remarked, "Flying in Vietnam means fighting your own aircraft." Maintenance formulas read, "Pour soindexes," thinner air, reduced lift. Note 1, additional wounded passenger, reduced safe altitude margin. Some days, crews had to choose enough ammo for the next platoon or one more medevac bleeding out. Technical decisions turned into moral ones. Before each mission, crews balanced fuel payload and firepower. A small miscalculation could cost lift or overload the engine. Nature was merciless. Tropical rain, thick fog, sudden gusts turned every sortie into a gamble. A CH-47 could be grounded simply because visibility fell a few meters. On the highlands, fog forced OH-6s to fly just above the treetops right inside machine gun range. A technician recalled, "We'd fix one bird, it flew out and came back with dozens of bullet holes. But if it didn't fly, the infantry died." Maintenance became a parallel war. Technicians worked non-stop in makeshift shelters, checking rotor blades and hydraulics. Minor deviations increased accident probability. AH-1, Cobras required twice the care. Recoil from firing could throw off the sight system. "No battlefield erodes engines like Vietnam," one engineer wrote. But if the helicopters stopped flying, air mobility collapsed. Still, people adapted. Pilots practiced landing in tiny LZs, dodging gusts, even flying through rain to resupply surrounded units. Technicians deployed rapid maintenance, replacing turbine blades right on the front line instead of sending aircraft back. Designers in the US adjusted materials and dust filters based on field reports. The message was clear: the sky belonged to no one, but missions succeeded through technical and tactical adaptation. Every completed sortie testified to human ingenuity and machine endurance. From the jungles of Southeast Asia, the 1st Cavalry Division proved air mobility could survive even the harshest conditions. The Vietnam War was ultimately a balance sheet of attrition. Every sortie, every helicopter, every life was entered as numbers in a logbook. The air mobility doctrine, with its ambition to conquer the sky, was paid for in blood, sweat, and limits that no technology could erase. Airlift brought speed but exposed the breaking points of both man and machine. More than 5,000 helicopters were lost in the war. The UH-1 Huey alone, the symbol of the air cavalry, saw 3,300 aircraft shot down, crashed, or written off. Each Huey was a technical achievement worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But against low-altitude fire, they were vulnerable. Heavy 12.7mm machine guns, SA-7 missiles, even AK-47 rounds could turn a helicopter into fragments. Every aircraft lost was a warning about combat risk. The heaviest losses weren't metal. 2,200 pilots, young men who flew through jungle fire, were killed. 2,700 crewmen working non-stop in 40 degrees heat to keep the fleet flying never returned. They died in shelling mines or from sheer exhaustion. Each number was a life cut short. Each flight was a mission, with risk beyond any formula. In practice, every air assault was a gamble. A CH-47 Chinook could carry an entire platoon. But if the engine overheated or the landing zone was too tight, the pilot had to cut payload immediately. One operations officer spread flight logs on the table. The number of reinsertions within the same area over 72 hours rose sharply as objectives fell back after withdrawal. Charts of flight minutes per square kilometer held thickened each week, yet the territory actually held stayed thin. The effectiveness curve flattened. The helicopter attrition curve shot upward, diminishing returns as wear increased. Tactical victories still came. Speed, surprise, and overwhelming firepower gave the U.S. the advantage in battles like Ia Drang, but the durability of those results was low. When helicopters departed and infantry left the landing zone, ground just seized, often slipped back into enemy hands. In guerrilla wartime mattered more than space. The enemy exploited this weak staying power to the fullest. The greatest limit of air mobility was not turbine life armor or payload, it was strategy. Airlift could put infantry anywhere very fast, but it could not hold the ground afterward. It won battles, but could not decide a long political people's war. A U.S. officer after Ia Drang said, "Technology can push the limits, but strategy is still limited by people." Air mobility changed how America fought, but it could not rescue a flawed strategy. The Vietnam battlefield was unforgiving, but the United States did not stand still in the face of those limits. First came technology. The UH-1 Huey. The soul of the air cavalry was tough, but not enough for Vietnam's environment. Bell Helicopter responded with the UH-1H, a stronger engine, improved dust filters, and light armor plating for pilot protection extending range under extreme heat conditions. A bigger turning point was the AH-1 Cobra, the first dedicated attack helicopter. With a narrow profile 7.62mm machine guns and Hydra 70 rockets, the Cobra became a nightmare for hidden firing positions in the jungle. One pilot said, "Hueys bring the guys to the fight, and we clear the way with fire." The Cobra turned helicopters from transport platforms into frontline weapons. Next came logistics, the bloodstream of air operations. The FARP forward arming and refueling point allowed refueling and rearming close to the front. Before that, helicopters had to fly dozens of kilometers back to base, wasting time and risking ambush. With a FARP, a small team could build a station in hours, stock JP-4 rockets and machine gun ammunition. A Huey could land, refuel, rearm, and be airborne again in under 10 minutes. A 1966 report noted that one FARP could support about 50 sorties a day, keeping the tempo constant. One FARP was hit by mortars after its dust signatures and repetitive flight paths gave it away. In 3 minutes, the fuel reload chain collapsed. The Doctrine lived on speed and died when speed revealed patterns. Even so, spare part shortages remained a nightmare. With readiness hovering around 70%, many helicopters sat grounded for lack of components. The only solution's cannibalization, strip the dead to save the living. In dusty makeshift shelters, technicians tore apart airframes too damaged to fly to keep the rest alive. An engine from a shot-down Huey could save another aircraft. Imperfect, but it kept the fleet in the air. A technician in Da Nang said, "We fix aircraft and buy one more day of flying." Handwritten depot logs read, "Pull rotor from frame A to save frame B." Small note below A was a dedicated medevac. Each rescue like that meant someone elsewhere lost their next flight. Logistics thinking evolved too. The U.S. shifted from hour-based maintenance to predictive logistics, analyzing data from thousands of sorties to forecast weak points, turbines, hydraulics, rotor blades, and replace them before failure. This approach reduced downtime, raising readiness to nearly 80% by 1967. Readiness increased. On the other hand, scheduled replacements sometimes reduced on-call flexibility. To stay on schedule, technicians occasionally pulled aircraft from alert status even when they were still healthy. To run the entire system, more than 8,000 engineers and technicians worked non-stop from major bases like Saigon to tiny outposts in the jungle. Each week they consumed 50,000 drums of JP-4, enough to fill dozens of swimming pools. A massive industrial chain was built temporarily on red Southeast Asian soil. The message behind these solutions was clear. America industrialized the sky. Cobras countered anti-aircraft fire. FARP solved logistical distance. Predictive logistics cut downtime. Each fix was an incremental measure that stabilized the air mobility cycle, turning a bold idea into a continuous operational system. But they were all tools. The decisive variable remained manpower and operational discipline. The outcome did not rest solely in helicopters' fuel or firepower. At the center of air mobility, the core of the system was people and procedure, the kind of fuel that cannot be measured in gallons or weight. It was the courage of pilots, the patience of technicians, and the resolve of those who turned the sky into a place of rescue. In smoke and fire, they fought to preserve humanity inside war. Every sortie was proof that human beings were the lifeblood of the division that could fly. Air cavalry pilots lived under a brutal rhythm, 4-6 sorties per day, from sunrise to midnight. One sortie might be an insertion into a red zone, a supply run along a front line, or a medical evacuation under heavy fire. Every takeoff meant accepting high levels of risk. Heavy 12.7mm machine guns, shoulder-fired rockets, and Highland gusts all could end everything in an instant. Men whispered, "Survive 100 sorties, and you'll survive the war." It was a high mark difficult to reach. Many never returned, leaving behind burned-out UH-1s in the jungle. Among all sorties, dust-off medical evacuation helicopters became the brightest symbol of humanity. Unarmed, they dove into kill zones to pull the wounded out of death's reach. From 1962 to 1973, dust-off flew 900,000 evacuations, saving 97% of casualties who made it aboard. One dust-off pilot, Captain Charles Kelly, said, "When there are wounded, I will fly." He was killed in 1964, but the spirit lived on with every liftoff. An Army surgeon wrote, "Unarmed, painted with crosses, we thought it was just a humanitarian convention." But on some days it reduced direct fire at the cockpit. The enemy hesitated half a second. Half a second was enough to climb another 20 feet. The same decision saved someone here and placed someone else at risk somewhere else. Dust-off missions were raw, no rockets or machine guns. Only pilot medic and the thin skin of a Huey. The sky became a hospital. The rotor's sound signaled medevac activity. Not only pilots made miracles. Technicians in dusty shelters were silent heroes. They repaired helicopters under flashlights with artillery falling nearby. A Huey might need new turbine blades after 25 flight hours. Yet, in emergencies, they stretched it a few hours longer just to make one more life-saving sortie. "Every time I fix a helicopter, I know I've saved dozens of lives," one technician said. Many died working outdoors. They never appeared in victory reports. Without them, air mobility would snap. Human will also appeared in moments beyond all regulations. In the A Shao Valley, one dust-off pilot flew 12 sorties in a single day, though only 6 were allowed. He knew wounded troops would not survive the night. A medevac medic stayed in a landing zone under fire to bandage a casualty before dragging him aboard. These actions went beyond statistics, beyond written orders, because they believed every life was worth the risk. Air mobility, for all its complexity, could not exist without people. Helicopters could be improved, logistics optimized, but only willpower turned the sky into a place of salvation. They flew through war carrying hope and compassion. They, a military doctor, wrote, turned helicopters into flying hospitals, turned the sky into a place to show humanity. Behind cold numbers, 900,000 evacuations, 97% survival, were stories of people who risked their own lives to save others. The Vietnam battlefield was never safe, but in that harshness, human will shone bright. They were the fuel not found in any logbook, and through every sortie, they reminded the world, no matter how brutal war becomes, compassion and sacrifice still define us. P8. Born from Vietnam, air mobility grew beyond experimental boundaries to become a doctrinal legacy challenging old truths, placing speed above firepower and flexibility above brute strength. When UH-1 Hueys roared over the Ia Drang Valley, when dust-off pilots dove into red zones to evacuate the wounded, they were not only fighting for that day, they were shaping the combat doctrines of tomorrow. From there, air mobility evolved into a global principle. In the 1991 Gulf War, Apaches and Black Hawks, descendants of the Huey and Cobra, used aerial maneuver to destroy Iraqi armored columns with unprecedented speed and precision. In Afghanistan and Iraq, units such as the 101st Airborne Air Assault used helicopters across mountains and deserts, inserting infantry deep into enemy territory. NATO allies, from Britain's 16 Air Assault Brigade to European forces, adopted that legacy, turning helicopters into the backbone of modern operations. In Vietnam, the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile won many battles from Ia Drang to A Shao, but could not salvage a flawed strategy. No strategy can be rescued once it goes wrong, a U.S. general once said, but the right tactics can right the future. Air mobility proved that America may have lost the war, but the doctrine won against time. The legacy of air mobility is not only a doctrine, it is a set of questions. How many hours of maintenance are we willing to trade for 10 minutes of maneuver? How much fuel for one wounded soldier's survival? How many repeated flight patterns before the enemy learns the route? Years later, Apaches and Black Hawks flew by that same formula, only with thicker armor and a far larger logistical footprint behind them. Same principle, different technical logistical foundation. Look back, people once mocked the idea of an air-mobile force. They believed helicopters could not survive in the jungle, that the sky could not sustain a combat tempo. But in Vietnam, through Fireblood and missions flown against death helicopters proved the opposite. They carried soldiers' ammunition and above all the belief that limits could be broken. The legacy of air mobility is a story of perseverance of pilots, technicians, and infantry who elevated the sky into an operational domain. That echo remains in every modern battlefield. And then the arc closed. Those who once called helicopters logistics toys now observe Hueys on museum floors. From the Ia Drang sand table map in 1964 to Apache flight paths over the desert in 1991, the once doubted idea became the standard. Airspace became critical maneuver space.